He could see the flaw in everything. Not metaphorically, not in the way that cynics see the flaw, which is to say from a distance, through the comfortable lens of disapproval, without the burden of understanding exactly how to fix what they are criticizing. Perturabo saw flaws the way an architect sees load-bearing failures, with precision, with total comprehension, with the immediate reflexive awareness of how the flaw could be corrected, and the simultaneous awareness that no one around him was going to correct it, and that no one had asked him to, and that the asking, when it came, would probably not be for the thing he was best at, but for the thing no one else wanted to do. This is the story of the Iron Warriors, the Fourth Legion, the sons of the Lord of Iron. And it begins not with a war, because there are enough wars in this history already, but with a boy on a world called Olympia, who could look at a fortress wall and tell you in the time it took to draw a breath exactly where it would fail, exactly how it would fall, and exactly how to build it so that it would not. Olympia was a world of city-states, high-walled, factional, perpetually feuding, each one guarding its own territory with the jealous intensity of communities that had been fighting their neighbors long enough that the fighting had become the culture rather than something the culture occasionally produced. The walls mattered on Olympia. They were not decorative. They were the line between your people and the people who wanted what your people had. And the engineering of those walls was the engineering of survival, not aesthetics. A good wall was a living wall. A bad wall was a grave. The boy appeared in the court of a tyrant named Damekos, one of the more powerful of Olympia's city-state rulers, a man whose position required the maintenance of alliances and the management of rivalries, and the specific political intelligence that long-term dynastic governance demands. How the boy arrived is described in the terms that all Primarch origin stories are described in: the falling from the sky, the mysterious provenance, the child who was not quite a child. Damekos took him in, raised him. The boy chose his own name, not one of the venerated heroes from the Olympian traditions, as would have been expected of someone raised in a tyrant's household. He chose Perturabo, an ancient title for those of prodigious ability, a word whose roots in the old tongues meant something close to "I shall endure." It proved, as names sometimes do when they are chosen well, to be a perfect description of the mind it was given to. Perturabo's gift was geometry. Not in the narrow mathematical sense, though the mathematics were there, running beneath everything else like the structural supports beneath a finished building. His gift was the ability to perceive spatial relationships at a depth and a speed that no unaugmented human mind could match, and that most augmented minds would have struggled with. He could look at a structure and understand it completely, not just its visible surfaces, its hidden supports, its weight distribution, the forces that acted on every junction and every span, the stress points where accumulated load concentrated, and where failure would propagate if anything gave. He understood buildings the way a musician understands sound, from the inside, as a living thing whose structure was not merely functional, but expressive. He was designing improvements to Olympia's fortifications before he was old enough by the standards of the court to participate in the councils where such designs were discussed. The improvements were good. They were better than good. They were the kind of contribution that a mature and experienced military engineer might produce after decades of study, offered by a child whose formal education had not yet begun, generated apparently from the innate capacity of a mind that had been built for this, and that was expressing its nature the way all minds express their nature when given an object worthy of their attention. Damekos was impressed. This is worth noting because it matters later, when the relationship between the boy and the man who raised him becomes part of the larger story. Damekos was genuinely impressed. He recognized what he had. He gave Perturabo access to the libraries and the engineering workshops and the fortification plans of the city-state, and he watched the boy absorb them with a speed that confirmed what the initial designs had suggested, which was that Olympia had in its possession a mind of extraordinary capability. He spent time with the boy. He tried to reach him. The boy did not reach back. Perturabo, by every surviving account, never trusted the Olympians and refused to return any affection that Damekos offered him. He shunned most of his foster siblings, gave nothing back to a man who genuinely tried to be a father to him, and reserved whatever warmth his character was capable of for a single person, his foster sister Caliphone, who alone among the household seemed to earn his trust. Perturabo built. This is the part of his story that the later accounts, the ones that focus on the heresy and the fall, tend to skip past quickly, and it is the part that you have to sit with if you want to understand why the fall matters. He built. Not just fortifications, though the fortifications were extraordinary, walls and defensive systems that incorporated principles Olympia's existing engineers had not considered, and that made Damekos' city-state of Lochos, over the years of Perturabo's childhood, the most defensible position on the planet. He built other things, machines, mechanisms, solutions to problems that Olympia's infrastructure had been living with for generations because nobody had applied the right kind of mind to them. He improved irrigation systems. He redesigned water distribution. He looked at the problems of civilian life with the same comprehensive understanding he brought to military architecture, and he solved them with the same thoroughness. He was not happy in the way that other people were happy. He was not demonstrative about the satisfaction the work gave him, and the coldness that defined his relationships with people did not extend to his relationship with the work itself. The work was the one thing he could engage with fully, without the distrust that colored everything else. The walls did not need to be evaluated for hidden motives. The engineering problems did not require the management of political relationships. The work was clean in a way that people were not, and Perturabo engaged with it cleanly, and the results were extraordinary. Damekos saw this too, and Damekos, who was a tyrant in the Olympian political sense, and who understood the specific requirements of his position, began to direct the boy's capabilities toward the things that the tyrant's position required, which were not always the things the boy would have chosen if the choosing had been left to him. Fortifications first, siege engines second, the instruments of warfare that Olympia's political culture demanded of anyone who wanted to maintain power among its competing city-states. Perturabo provided them. He provided them with excellence, because excellence was the only mode his mind operated in when it was engaged with a problem. But the civilian projects slowed. The irrigation improvements were not completed. The water distribution redesign was set aside. The things that Perturabo had been building for the benefit of the people who lived inside the walls were gradually replaced by things designed for the benefit of the man who owned the walls. This is where the first crack appears. Not a large one, not a dramatic rift between the boy and his adopted father, a small thing, almost invisible, the kind of thing that in most lives does not produce consequences, because most lives do not operate at the scale where small misalignments become civilization-ending disasters. Perturabo wanted to build. Damekos wanted him to build weapons. The distance between these two things was not large. It was the distance between a mind that saw all structures as worthy of its attention, and an authority that saw only some structures as strategically useful. Perturabo bridged the distance. He built what was asked, he suppressed what was not. And the suppression, over years, over the specific formative years of a being whose emotional architecture was being constructed at the same time as his intellectual architecture, became part of what he was. He did not stop wanting to build. He stopped expecting that the wanting would be answered, which is a different thing, a harder thing. The thing that happens to people whose deepest capabilities are consistently redirected toward purposes they did not choose, and who learn through the slow education of repeated disappointment that the choosing is not theirs to do. He became, in those years on Olympia, before the Emperor found him, something that the accounts of the period describe with the careful language of witnesses observing a mind they could not fully understand, a being of extraordinary capability and deepening coldness. Brilliant and productive, and increasingly alone in the way that people become alone when the fundamental thing about them is consistently unmet by the world they inhabit. The Emperor came, as the Emperor always came, with the weight of a civilization behind him, and the offer that no Primarch could refuse. The offer of purpose at a scale that matched the capabilities the Emperor had engineered into his sons. Perturabo accepted. He took command of his legion, the Fourth, who had been fighting the Great Crusade under the designation of their gene seed's originator, and who had already begun to develop the characteristics that their Primarch's nature would amplify and formalize. They were siege specialists. They were builders of war. They were the ones who could take any fortification in the galaxy apart, given sufficient time and sufficient resources, and who understood the specific patience that siege warfare demands of those who practice it. Perturabo gave them his name, the Iron Warriors, and the name was not simply a designation, it was a statement of intent, of character, of the relationship between the Legion and the material it worked with. Iron bends but does not break. Iron endures. Iron does not require beauty to be functional. Iron is the material of things that are built to last and that last because they are built correctly, not because they are built to be admired. The Great Crusade gave the Iron Warriors their purpose, and then it gave them their wound. The wound was not dramatic. It did not arrive with the suddenness of a blade or the catastrophe of a betrayal. It arrived in increments, across decades, in the assignments that the Great Crusade's operational demands placed on the Fourth Legion, and that Perturabo accepted, because accepting was what you did when the Crusade's machinery directed your capabilities toward its needs. The Iron Warriors were assigned to sieges. This was logical. They were the best at it. Perturabo's gift for understanding fortifications translated directly into a gift for dismantling them, and the Great Crusade encountered fortifications on almost every world it brought into compliance, because the Age of Strife had given the galaxy's scattered human populations 10,000 years to build walls around themselves, and those walls did not come down willingly. The Iron Warriors brought them down, methodically, comprehensively, with the engineering precision that Perturabo demanded of everything his legion did, and that his legion delivered, because his standards were not optional. They were also assigned to garrisons. This was less logical, or at least less flattering, and the distinction matters. A garrison assignment is what you give to a force that you need to be somewhere unexciting for an extended period, holding ground that has already been won so that the forces that won it can move on to the next objective. It is not prestigious work. It does not produce the kind of campaign narratives that enter the Crusade's historical record in the chapters titled with names like the Triumph at or the Liberation of. It produces logistics reports and duty rosters and the slow, patient maintenance of a position whose strategic value is expressed in the fact that it remains held rather than in any dramatic act of holding. The Iron Warriors garrisoned. They garrisoned while other legions fought the campaigns that the Crusades celebrated. They held the positions that other legions had taken in spectacular assaults and that somebody needed to maintain afterward. The dull, necessary work that made the spectacular assaults strategically meaningful rather than simply dramatic. They rotated through assignments that the Departamento Munitorum's operational planning distributed to them because the Iron Warriors could be relied upon to execute them competently, and because the Iron Warriors did not complain in the institutional channels where complaints were heard. Perturabo noticed. He noticed everything. His mind, which could not look at a structure without understanding it completely, could not look at his legion's pattern of assignments without understanding that pattern completely either. The Iron Warriors received the worst assignments. Not the most dangerous, though many of them were dangerous. The worst in the sense of the most grinding, the most unglamorous, the most likely to produce high casualties for low recognition. They were the attrition force, the siege force, the garrison force, the force that did the work that made it possible for other legions to do the work that earned the glory. He logged it. This is one of the most revealing details of Perturabo's character, the fact that he did not simply feel the injustice but documented it. He kept records, careful, precise, exhaustive records of every assignment the Iron Warriors received, every casualty count, every campaign where the 4th Legion had done the grinding preparatory work that another legion had then exploited for the final dramatic victory. He cross-referenced these records against the assignments given to other legions. He calculated casualty ratios. He compared the recognition his legion received for its work against the recognition other legions received for equivalent or lesser contributions. The ledger he was building was not a document of rage. It was something colder. It was the careful accounting of a mind that believed in systems and that was documenting the system's failure to treat his legion justly. The ledger was also invisible. He did not submit it. He did not present it at the councils of the Primarchs or raise it through the formal channels that the Crusade's administrative structure provided for exactly this kind of grievance. He held it privately, adding to it over the decades, each new entry confirming what the previous entries had already established. Each confirmation deepening not the anger but the resignation, the growing conviction that the system would not correct itself because the system did not recognize the imbalance as a problem requiring correction. Rogel Dawn received the commission to fortify Terra. This requires a pause. Not because the event itself was complicated. The Emperor needed Terra fortified. He chose Dawn. The choice was logical, in the sense that all the Emperor's choices were logical when viewed from the Emperor's perspective, which was longer and wider and more informed by considerations that were not available to any of his sons. But logical and just are not always the same thing, and from Perturabo's perspective, which was the perspective of the greatest siege engineer in the galaxy sitting in a legion that had spent decades doing the work that no one else wanted to do. The choice was not just. He was the builder. He had been the builder since Olympia, since the childhood where the love of construction had been the clearest and most honest thing about him. Dawn was also a builder in his way, the Imperial Fists, a legion of fortifiers whose approach to defensive architecture was methodical and thorough and deserving of respect. But the commission to fortify Terra was not simply a job of military engineering. It was the statement of trust. It said, "You are the one I choose to build the most important thing." And the Emperor chose Dawn. Perturabo did not speak about this in public. The record of the period does not contain an outburst, a formal protest, any of the dramatic moments of confrontation that the histories of other Primarchs' grievances preserve. He received the news. He processed it. And he added it to the ledger, alongside all the other entries, another line in the careful documentation of everything that the system had taken from him and everything it had given to those it favored instead. The Iron Warriors fought. This is what they did. Between the documentation of the grievance and the moment when the grievance finally became something that could no longer be contained by documentation alone. They fought the campaigns that the Crusade assigned them, and they fought them well. Because Perturabo's standards did not vary with his mood, and the Iron Warriors' commitment to excellence in the execution of their craft was not contingent on whether the craft was being recognized or rewarded. They were professionals. The deepest and most corrosive thing about Perturabo's resentment was that it did not diminish the quality of his work. He continued to be brilliant. He continued to produce results that other legions could not replicate. He continued to be the best siege engineer in the galaxy, while the galaxy continued to treat siege engineering as the job you gave to the legion you did not have anything more interesting for. His relationships with his brothers suffered, not from open conflict, but from the slow withdrawal that resentment produces when it is maintained over decades without expression. He attended the councils. He contributed when the tactical situation required his contribution. He maintained the appearance of participation in the brotherhood that the Primarchs were supposed to share. But the warmth that some of his brothers felt for each other, the bonds that were built from shared campaigns and shared danger, and the mutual recognition of capabilities that genuine respect produces, Perturabo did not build those bonds. He was present without being connected. He was a colleague rather than a brother, and the difference between those two things, which seems small in the stating, became large in the living. Some of his brothers tried. Fulgrim, before the Daemon Blade had begun its work on him, attempted to engage Perturabo on the subject of their shared interest in craftsmanship. The Phoenician, whose understanding of beauty and its pursuit was the most refined in the Crusade, reached out to the Lord of Iron with the genuine curiosity of a mind that recognized excellence in a different mode, and wanted to understand it. The conversation, which the records of the period preserve in fragments, revealed something that both Primarchs found interesting and that Perturabo found painful. Fulgrim saw beauty in Perturabo's work. Not the beauty that Fulgrim pursued in his own craft, the beauty of perfect form and perfect expression. A different kind, the beauty of something that works. That does exactly what it was designed to do, with nothing wasted and nothing unnecessary. Every element in its correct position and serving its correct function. Fulgrim called it elegant. Perturabo heard the compliment and did not know what to do with it. because compliments on his work were so rare in his experience that receiving one felt less like recognition and more like something that needed to be examined for hidden intent. This is one of the saddest details in a story that is not short of them. Fulgrim was genuine. The compliment was genuine. And Perturabo could not receive it, because the decades of unrecognized work had built in him a specific kind of armor that filtered everything that came from outside through the assumption that what came from outside was either instrumental or indifferent. He could not be praised because he had learned to suspect praise. He could not be reached because he had spent too long unreached. The wall he had built around himself was as expertly constructed as anything he had ever designed for Olympia, and it served the same purpose, which was to keep what was inside safe from what was outside. And the cost of its effectiveness was that nothing from outside could get through it either. Dawn's relationship to Perturabo was the most painful of all, because it was the most direct expression of the wound. They should have been allies. They were both builders. They both understood fortification at the highest level, approached from different angles but converging on the same fundamental principles. In a different story, with different assignments, and a different pattern of recognition, they might have been the partnership that the Crusade needed, the architect and the siegemaster working in complementary function, each one making the other's work better through the kind of rigorous engagement that only genuine peers can provide. Instead, they became mirrors that reflected each other's limitations. Dawn saw in Perturabo the resentment that Dawn's own temperament would never have permitted himself, because Dawn was the kind of man who processed assignment as duty and duty as completion and did not maintain a ledger of what he was owed. Perturabo saw in Dawn the recognition that Perturabo had never received: the Imperial Commission, the Emperor's trust, the position at the center of the Imperium's most important project, and the sight of it in another man's possession was the confirmation of everything the ledger contained. They argued, not once but many times across the decades, in councils and in private, and in the specific way that people argue when the argument is not really about the thing they are arguing about, but about the thing underneath it that neither of them can name directly. Perturabo criticized Dawn's fortifications. Dawn defended them. The criticisms were often technically valid, because Perturabo's eye for structural weakness was the best in the galaxy, and Dawn's designs, however excellent, were not immune to the scrutiny of the one mind capable of finding their vulnerabilities. The defenses of the criticisms were also valid, because Dawn's designs were excellent and the vulnerabilities Perturabo identified were often marginal rather than fundamental. The argument was real, and it was also a displacement. Two men fighting about walls because they could not fight about the thing the walls represented. The resentment grew. It did not peak. That is important. It did not reach a crescendo and explode. It simply grew. The way geological pressure grows in a fault line, accumulating stress over time in ways that are measurable by the right instruments, but that do not announce themselves through any single dramatic event. Perturabo did not wake up one morning and decide to betray the Emperor. He woke up 10,000 mornings over 30 years of campaigning, and each morning the ledger was a little longer, and the distance between what he deserved and what he received was a little wider, and the wall around him was a little higher, and the warmth that might have prevented the wall from closing completely was a little harder to feel through the iron he had built around himself. the Emperor broke the Iron Warriors by neglecting them. Not through malice, not through any decision that the Emperor made with the intent of producing the outcome it produced. Through the simple, devastating failure to see that one of his sons was keeping a careful record of everything that hurt, and that the record was becoming, year by year, the structure that the son's entire identity was organized around. The Emperor did not break Perturabo the way the Chaos Gods broke Horus or Lorgar or Magnus. He broke Perturabo through indifference, which is the specific kind of breaking that the broken person can never fully distinguish from intentional cruelty. Because indifference and intentional cruelty look exactly the same from inside the wound they produce. Olympia rebelled. Damikos was dead by then, the tyrant who had raised Perturabo gone, and in his absence the old politics of the city-states had reasserted themselves. The homeworld that had raised him, the people who had sent their sons to serve in his legion, and who had maintained the connection between the Iron Warriors and their origin world across the decades of the Crusade, rose against the Imperium. The reasons were the reasons that rebellions always have, a mixture of the legitimate and the manipulated, of genuine grievance against the Imperium's demands, and the specific exploitation of that grievance by agents whose interests were not aligned with the population's welfare. The tithes had been heavy. The levy of young men for the Legion and the broader Imperial Guard had been ongoing for decades. Olympia's city-states, which had never fully abandoned the factional rivalries that had characterized their pre-compliance politics, had found in the Imperium's demands a new grievance to organize around, and a new enemy to unite against. Perturabo took his legion home. The decision was made with the speed and the completeness that characterized all of Perturabo's significant decisions, the cold assessment of a situation followed by the total commitment to the course of action the assessment produced. He did not send an emissary. He did not negotiate. He did not attempt the patient diplomatic resolution that some of his brothers might have pursued, and that the situation might, with careful handling, have been amenable to. He went himself with the Iron Warriors to the world that had made him, to the people who had known him as a boy, and he brought to the problem the tools he had been given. Siege tools, bombardment tools, the instruments of reduction that the Iron Warriors had spent decades perfecting against the galaxy's most formidable fortifications, now applied to the walls of cities he had helped design, against defensive positions whose weaknesses he knew, because he had identified them himself in the years before the Emperor came and the Crusade began. The walls of Olympia, which had been the first thing Perturabo had ever improved, fell to the hand that had improved them. This was not the first decimation in the Iron Warriors' history. When Perturabo had first taken command of his legion, years before Olympia's rebellion, he had reviewed their war record and found it wanting. His response had been immediate and absolute. 1 in 10 of his own warriors, selected by lottery, beaten to death by their comrades' bare hands. The imperial court had protested. Some called him a madman given absolute power over a legion too soon. But Perturabo's message had been delivered, and the Iron Warriors had received it, and the legion that emerged from that first decimation was the cold, unforgiving, brutally efficient force that the Great Crusade's worst assignments could not break. On Olympia, the decimation was different. He demanded the Olympians enact it on themselves. 1 in 10 of their own, killed by their own hands, or face extermination and enslavement. Many cities refused. Perturabo purged them anyway, overrunning the fortresses he had built, sparing no one. Iron warriors who refused to participate in the genocide were struck down alongside the populations they were unwilling to kill. By the time the massacre was over, 5 million Olympians were dead, and the rest were enslaved. Caliphone died in the palace. This is the detail that the histories of the Iron Warriors fall place at the center of the story, and they are right to place it there. Because what happened in the palace of Damekos' city-state is the moment that every other moment in Perturabo's story either builds toward or follows from. Caliphone was Perturabo's sister, not biologically, adopted the same way Perturabo had been adopted, raised in the same household by the same tyrant, sharing the childhood that had shaped Perturabo's earliest years. She was one of the few people in Perturabo's life who had ever seen him clearly, without being either intimidated by what she saw or interested in using it for something. She had known the boy who loved to build before the man who was forced to destroy had replaced him. She carried in her relationship to Perturabo the memory of what he had been before the Crusade took it. And she carried it without sentimentality, with the directness of someone who loved something honestly, and who was willing to say what they saw even when what they saw was painful. She named his flaws. In the palace, during the destruction of Olympia, while the world he had once called home was being reduced to rubble by the legion he commanded, and the people he had grown up among were dying in the numbers that siege warfare always produces, Caliphone stood in front of her brother and told him what he had become. The accounts of the exchange do not agree on the exact words, which suggests that the exchange was witnessed by people who were too close to it to record it dispassionately, and who afterwards reconstructed what they had heard through the specific filter of what they had felt while hearing it. But the shape is consistent. She told him he was destroying the thing that had made him. She told him the walls he was pulling down were his walls, built by his hands, designed by his mind, maintained by the people whose deaths he was now engineering. She told him that the man she had known as a boy, the one who loved to build and who found joy in the quiet satisfaction of making things work, was gone, replaced by something that could not see the difference between justice and fury. He killed her. He put his hands around her throat and he killed the last person in the galaxy who loved him enough to tell him the truth about what he was. And the killing was the end of everything that had come before it, and the beginning of everything that came after. Not because the killing was the worst thing Perturabo had done. 3 million Olympians were dead. The decimation of his own legion had produced its own body count. In the raw arithmetic of atrocity, the death of one woman does not register against those numbers. But Caliphone was not a number. Caliphone was the connection. The last thread between the man who built and the man who destroyed, and when Perturabo severed it, the thing that might still have been repaired was permanently ended. He stood in the palace of his childhood, with the body of his sister at his feet, and the ruins of his homeworld visible through the windows that he had once looked through while designing improvements to the city's water supply. And he understood what he had done. Perturabo always understood. That was the specific cruelty of his intelligence. That it could not be switched off, that it continued to function with total clarity even in the moments when total clarity was the last thing a human being would have wanted. He could see the structure of what he had made of himself as clearly as he could see the structure of anything else. He could trace the load-bearing failures in his own character, with the same precision he brought to fortification analysis. He knew where the cracks were. He knew where the weight had concentrated. He knew that the structure was past the point of repair. Horus found him there. Or Horus's agents found him there, or the specific combination of circumstance and the War Master's intelligence network produced the contact at the moment when the contact would be most effective. Because Horus was already planning the rebellion, and Horus understood, with the political genius that was his defining characteristic, that Perturabo at this moment was not going to be reached by any argument the Imperium could make. He went to Horus, not as a believer, not as a man who had been seduced by the chaos gods or converted by the theological arguments of the primordial truth or driven to madness by the butcher's nails or any of the other mechanisms that had claimed his brothers. He went as a man who had burned the last bridge and who could see, with the total clarity that was his curse, that there was nowhere else to go. The Imperium would not take him back. He had destroyed his homeworld. He had murdered his sister. He had slaughtered 5 million people whose only crime was living on the world that had raised him. The ledger of grievances that he had maintained for 30 years had been answered, finally, by the only answer that decades of silence had left available. And the answer was destruction, and the destruction had placed him outside the borders of anything the Emperor's forgiveness could cover. What Horus offered was that forgiveness, not the Emperor's forgiveness, which was no longer available. Horus's forgiveness. The understanding that what Perturabo had done on Olympia was known and was accepted and was not going to be held against him. That the War Master's rebellion had room for a man who had crossed every line that the Imperium drew and who needed somewhere to stand that did not require him to pretend the crossing had not happened. It was forgiveness, not recognition, that truly bound the Iron Warriors to Horus Lupercal. Perturabo would later say as much, or something close to it. The recognition was welcome, the operational authority was welcome. But the thing that kept him was simpler and more fundamental. Horus did not make him answer for Olympia. This is what makes Perturabo's fall distinct from every other traitor Primarch's. The others were claimed. Lorga was claimed by faith. Angron was claimed by the nails. Fulgrim was claimed by the daemon. Magnus was claimed by the consequences of his own best intentions. Horus was claimed by the patient. Surgical manipulation of powers that understood exactly where his wound was, and exactly how to press on it. Perturabo claimed himself. He was not pushed off the cliff. He walked to the edge, looked down, looked back at what was behind him, calculated that the distance was the same in both directions, and stepped. The Horus Heresy gave the Iron Warriors exactly what the Great Crusade had denied them: the right to use their capabilities without constraint, and the acknowledgement that those capabilities were essential. Horus understood what he had in Perturabo. The War Master, whatever else the corruption at Davin had done to him, had not lost the political intelligence that had made him the most effective leader in the Crusade. He looked at the Iron Warriors and he saw a siege force of unmatched capability, led by a Primarch whose strategic genius had been systematically underemployed for 3 decades, and whose resentment at that underemployment had now been converted, through the destruction of Olympia and everything it had cost, into a cold and total commitment to the only remaining direction. Horus gave Perturabo assignments that mattered. He gave him the sieges that the rebellion required, the fortified positions that stood between the traitor forces and their objectives. and he gave them without the condescension that Perturabo had spent the crusade detecting in every assignment that came from the imperial command structure. Whether this was genuine respect or the most effective available form of manipulation is a question that says more about the person asking it than about Horus. Both are true simultaneously. Horus genuinely respected Perturabo's capabilities, and he genuinely needed them. And the respect was genuine even if its expression was calibrated to produce the maximum useful output from the man receiving it. This is what makes Horus's corruption so complete and so terrible, that the corrupted version of Horus could offer genuine recognition and have the recognition be real, and have the reality of it serve the purposes of the Chaos Gods, without any contradiction between the genuineness and the instrumentality. The Chaos Gods are thorough. Horus was their instrument. The instrument could still play real notes. The Iron Warriors fought through the heresy with the sustained fury of a legion that had been waiting decades for permission to demonstrate what it could do. They reduced fortified positions that other legions had bypassed as too costly to assault directly. They conducted sieges that compressed years of conventional approach into weeks of overwhelming application. Perturabo's understanding of fortification deployed in reverse. Every defensive principle he had mastered used to identify the specific sequence of pressures that would bring a given structure down in the minimum possible time. They were devastating. The compliance worlds that the Iron Warriors had garrisoned during the Crusade learned what it meant to have the garrison turn against the fortifications it had been maintaining, and the lesson was uniformly terrible. They came to Terra. The Siege of Terra was Perturabo's masterwork in the way that a master of any craft recognizes the project that tests them most completely. Rogel Dawn had built the Imperial Palace into the most formidable defensive structure in the history of the galaxy. Perturabo had to take it apart. The two brothers who had argued about walls for 30 years, and who had never resolved the argument because the argument was never really about walls, finally met on terms that forced the resolution. Perturabo directed the siege lines. He designed the approach. He calculated the angles and the sequences and the specific application of force at specific points that would degrade Dawn's defenses in the order that produced maximum cumulative damage for minimum expenditure. He was, in this specific role at this specific moment, doing the thing he had always been meant to do. Applying the full capacity of his extraordinary mind to the largest and most consequential engineering problem in human history. The siege of the Imperial Palace was the conversation between Perturabo and Dawn that 30 years of argument had been the prelude to, conducted not in words, but in the language that both of them spoke most fluently, the language of walls and the forces that act upon them. Dawn held. This must be acknowledged. The palace held longer than the traitor projections had estimated, longer than the Chaos God's timeline had assumed, longer than Horus's patience could comfortably sustain. Dawn's work was good. The walls were where they needed to be. The redundancies functioned as designed. The defensive rings slowed the advance to the pace that Dawn had calculated was the minimum sustainable, and the Iron Warriors pushed against that pace with everything Perturabo had, and the pace held, mostly until it didn't. The breaches that the Iron Warriors forced in the palace walls were the specific points that Perturabo had identified as the defense's highest stress concentrations. The places where the weight of the wall's own design created the conditions for its failure, when sufficient external pressure was applied. Each breach was a statement in the 30-year argument. Each one said, "Here is where your design fails, and the failure is not random. It is the consequence of choices you made that I can see and you cannot." Whether Dawn read the statement as it was intended is not recorded in any account that has survived the Heresy's document wars. What is recorded is that the breaches were made, and that the Iron Warriors came through them, and that the fighting in the corridors of the Imperial Palace was among the most savage in the entire siege. The Iron Warriors at the Siege of Terror were not berserkers. They did not lose themselves in the violence the way the World Eaters did, abandoning formation and discipline in the ecstasy of cornate rage. They fought like the Iron Warriors always fought, methodically, with the cold precision of engineers applying calculated force to identified weaknesses. They brought their siege tools into the corridors of the palace and used them the way siege tools are designed to be used. And the specific horror of the Iron Warriors' contribution to the siege was not its excess but its efficiency. They were not trying to express anything through the violence. They were trying to complete a task. The task was the reduction of the galaxy's greatest fortification, and they were reducing it meter by metre, with the professional excellence that Perturabo had demanded of his legion from the beginning, and that the legion had never failed to deliver. The siege ended. Horus died. The traitors broke. Perturabo did not break. Not in the way that some of the other traitor forces broke, dissolving into the panic of an army that has lost its commander and its purpose simultaneously. The Iron Warriors withdrew in good order, maintaining their formation, protecting their flanks, conducting the retreat with the same engineering competence they had brought to the advance. They had been trained for this. Perturabo's preparation of his legion had always included preparation for failure, because a mind that could see structural weaknesses in everything included in everything the possibility that the structure it was currently building might not hold. The Great Scouring drove the traitors toward the Eye of Terror. Most of the traitor legions went. The Iron Warriors went differently. Perturabo had one more statement to make before the long exile began, and the statement was directed at the one person whose attention he had always wanted and never received in the form he wanted it. The Iron Cage was not a battle. It was a trap, designed and built by Perturabo with the total commitment of a mind that had decided to produce one final, unambiguous demonstration of what it was capable of and who that demonstration was for. He constructed the Eternal Fortress on the world of Siegemasters IV. 20 square miles of bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, razor wire, tank traps, and redoubts, shaped as an 8-pointed star. Not a real fortification in the defensive sense, not one designed to hold ground or protect anything of value. The center of the Eternal Fortress was empty. No keep, no command post, no objective worth taking. Just an open space watched by yet more defenses. The entire structure existed for one purpose, to draw Rogel Dawn into it and kill him there. Dawn came. He brought the entire Imperial Fist's Legion. He had declared publicly that he would dig Perturabo out of his hole and bring him back to Terra in an iron cage. And the declaration was both a boast and a decision, because Dawn was Dawn and the challenge was explicit, and the Imperial Fist's honor demanded a response. Some histories suggest Dawn had a second motive. The Codex Astartes crisis was reaching its peak, and Dawn, who was going to accept the breaking of the legions despite every instinct telling him not to, intended the assault on the Eternal Fortress as a collective ordeal, a pain that the entire legion would endure together before splitting into chapters. If that reading is correct, he chose to spend his warrior's blood as a sacrament of transition, which is either the most Imperial Fists thing conceivable or the most tragic. And it may be both. The Imperial Fists entered the iron cage and found over the days that followed that the cage was exactly what Perturabo had designed it to be. Every corridor led to a kill zone. Every apparent weakness was bait. Every advance that seemed to open a route through the maze produced a counter that closed it. Some Imperial Fists fought their way to the center and found nothing there. An empty space. The demonstration that the entire structure had been built not around an objective but around the killing. And the killing was the point. They were dying. The cage was consuming them with measured precision, converting the Imperial Fist's stubborn refusal to retreat into the mechanism that kept them inside the killing ground. When their ammunition ran out, they fought hand to hand, and the trenches of the Eternal Fortress ran with blood. Dawn himself was wounded. The Iron Warriors were taking losses too, significant losses. Because the Imperial Fist's refusal to die was not merely symbolic. It was the behavior of warriors who would rather be destroyed than admit that a wall had beaten them. The Ultramarines extracted them. Guilliman, informed of what was happening at Siegemasters IV, dispatched a force that broke the engagement before the two legions annihilated each other. The extraction was difficult, costly, and it was not clean. The Imperial Fists who emerged from the cage were diminished and changed in ways that the chapter's subsequent culture would carry forward for 10,000 years. The gene seed of the Imperial Fists who died inside the iron cage was collected by the Iron Warriors. And it was this offering, so the sources say, that earned Perturabo his dark ascension. The captured progenoid glands of Rogel Dawn's sons, offered to the Chaos Gods as a sacrifice, were the price that completed whatever bargain Perturabo had made. He became a Daemon Primarch not through devotion but through transaction. The most valuable thing he could offer was the genetic legacy of the brother he had spent 30 years trying to surpass. The Iron Warriors went into the Eye. Medrengard is what Perturabo builds when there are no constraints. Not the physical constraints of available material or engineering capability, which the Eye of Terror provides in abundance through the warp's ability to sustain structures that real space physics would not permit. The other constraints, the ones that come from building within a system that tells you what to build and how to build it, and who to build it for. On Medrengard there is no system. There is only Perturabo and the iron, and the time in the Eye is not the time of real space, and the building does not stop. The Daemon world that the Iron Warriors claimed as their stronghold in the Eye of Terror is not simply a fortress. The word fortress, with its connotations of a defined perimeter and a comprehensible geometry and a scale that the human eye can take in from a single vantage point, is inadequate. Medrengard is a construction project that has been running for 10,000 years without interruption, driven by a mind that has never lacked for vision, and that has, in the Eye, finally been freed from the necessity of building what other people need, and permitted to build what it actually wants. What it wants is everything. Every principle of fortification, every technique of siege architecture, every defensive concept and counter-concept that Perturabo has accumulated across his lifetime of study, expressed simultaneously at a scale that the warp makes possible, and that real space would not have tolerated. Medrengard has walls within walls within walls, defensive rings that recede toward a center that may or may not exist in a fixed location. Because the geometry of the place shifts in response to its master's will, and the warp's influence on the material that the structures are made from. It has been described by the very few Imperial sources who have observed it from sufficient distance to survive the observation as the most complete expression of paranoia ever constructed. Every possible threat anticipated and countered, and the counters themselves fortified against being overcome. Perturabo sits at its center and builds. Whether what he is building is beautiful or terrible or both depends entirely on the perspective of the observer and the criteria by which beauty and terror are being distinguished. And in the eye of terror, those criteria are not stable enough to produce consistent answers. The Iron Warriors who serve him have maintained, across 10,000 years in the Eye, a quality that distinguishes them from every other traitor legion in ways that the Iron Warriors themselves consider significant, and that outside observers tend to find unsettling for reasons they cannot always articulate. They are professional. The word sounds wrong applied to warriors who have spent millennia in the Eye of Terror's warp-soaked darkness, who fight in campaigns whose objectives serve the ruinous powers whether the warriors themselves acknowledge that service or not, who have been changed by the Eye's proximity in ways that range from the cosmetically disturbing to the fundamentally inhuman. But the word is accurate. The Iron Warriors in the Eye maintain standards. They maintain discipline. They maintain the engineering precision that Perturabo built into their culture from the beginning, and that the culture has preserved through every subsequent century, because the preservation of it is the nearest thing the Iron Warriors have to an identity now that every other defining characteristic has been consumed by the Eye. They are not devoted to chaos. This is the thing about the Iron Warriors that the Order Malleus has spent considerable effort trying to characterize correctly. Because the characterization matters for the operational response that the Inquisition deploys against them, and getting the characterization wrong produces responses calibrated to the wrong kind of threat. The World Eaters are devoted to Khorne. The Death Guard are devoted to Nurgle. The Thousand Suns are entangled with Tzeentch in ways that are impossible to separate from what the Legion is. The Iron Warriors are not devoted to anything except the work. Some of them have taken marks. The Eye's proximity makes refusal of chaos influence a matter of active resistance rather than passive neutrality, and active resistance is expensive over millennia. Individual Iron Warriors have accepted the gifts that the Chaos Gods offer, the mutations and the empowerments and the specific capabilities that patronage provides. And they have done so with the pragmatic assessment that accepting a tool that makes you better at your job is not the same thing as worshipping the entity that provides the tool. This is not entirely convincing as a philosophical position, and the Iron Warriors who hold it are not under the illusion that it is. They are under the pragmatic assessment that the alternative, which is fighting the Eye's influence with nothing but willpower indefinitely, produces outcomes that are not practically distinguishable from the outcomes that acceptance produces, and that waste considerable energy in the process. Others have resisted. There are Iron Warriors in the current age whose armor shows 10,000 years of modification and repair, but whose bodies show nothing that the warp has added without their consent. Warriors who have maintained the biological baseline of their Astartes physiology through the active rejection of everything the eye offers, and who consider this rejection a point of professional pride. They are not noble. They are not the heroic resistors that a simpler narrative might try to make them. They are practitioners of a craft who refuse to allow their tools to be contaminated by influences that they consider irrelevant to the craft's correct practice. The engineering is the thing. Everything else, including the source of the power that makes the engineering possible, is secondary. The Warsmith system emerged from the Iron Warriors' post-heresy organizational culture as the primary command structure of the fragmented legion. A Warsmith is the commander of a grand company, the Iron Warriors' equivalent of a chapter-sized formation, though the grand companies vary in size and capability depending on the specific Warsmith's resources and the specific campaigns he has been conducting. The title is not hereditary. It is not awarded by Perturabo, who has ascended to daemonhood and who participates in the direction of his legion in ways that are difficult to characterize from outside, because the nature of a daemon Primarch's involvement in mortal affairs is not easily observable by mortal instruments. The title is earned. It is earned through demonstrated competence, which in the Iron Warriors culture means demonstrated engineering and tactical excellence. The ability to take a fortification and build a fortification and manage the logistics of a siege and maintain the discipline of a force under conditions that would degrade the discipline of formations less thoroughly trained. The competition between warsmiths is constant and occasionally lethal. This is the specific way that the Iron Warriors culture handles the absence of a central authority capable of managing the ambitions of its most capable members, and the way it handles it is by allowing those ambitions to express themselves in competition that the community benefits from even when individual participants do not survive. A warsmith who cannot maintain his position against the other warsmiths who want it is a warsmith who was not good enough for the position, and the Iron Warriors do not mourn the insufficiently good. They replace them. The replacement is usually someone who demonstrated, through the specific act of removing the previous occupant, that they were better suited to the role. The Siege of Imperial Worlds is the Iron Warriors' primary mode of interaction with the galaxy outside the Eye, and it is conducted with the same methodical professionalism that characterized the Legion during the Great Crusade. The approach is not dramatic. The Iron Warriors do not descend on a target world with the rage of the World Eaters, or the pestilential horror of the Death Guard, or any of the aestheticized violence that the other traitor legions have developed as their distinctive modes of engagement. They approach a fortified world the way an engineer approaches a problem. They assess. They calculate. They identify the defensive position's strengths and weaknesses. They develop a plan. They execute the plan. The execution may take months. It may take years. The Iron Warriors are patient in the way that all good siege practitioners are patient. Because patience in a siege is not a virtue but a functional requirement. And the Iron Warriors do not confuse functional requirements with moral positions. The populations of worlds that the Iron Warriors conquer find in their conquerors something that the populations of worlds conquered by other traitor legions do not typically encounter, which is organization. The Iron Warriors do not massacre indiscriminately. They do not burn what they can use. They assess the conquered population the way they assess every other resource, for its utility, and they allocate it accordingly. Workers are put to work. Structures are maintained or repurposed. The infrastructure of the conquered world is preserved to the degree that preservation serves the Iron Warrior's operational needs, because destroying useful infrastructure is waste, and the Iron Warriors do not waste. This is not mercy. The distinction between organizational pragmatism and mercy is absolute, and the populations that experience Iron Warriors' governance learn the distinction quickly. A chaos warband that massacres a civilian population is terrible in an obvious way. A chaos warband that assesses a civilian population for labor value and puts the assessed population to work in conditions calibrated to extract maximum output at minimum maintenance cost is terrible in a way that is harder to articulate, and that the people experiencing it find, over time, worse. The horror of the Iron Warriors is not their excess. It is their efficiency. It is the sense that you are not being tortured for the pleasure of your torturers, but processed for the benefit of a system that does not care whether you live or die, as long as the output is maintained. Perturabo ascended to daemonhood in the aftermath of the Iron Cage, the gene seed of the Imperial Fist's dead serving as the offering that completed whatever bargain the Chaos Gods had been building toward. The circumstances are recorded sparsely in the Iron Warrior's own archives, and more extensively in the Ordo Malleus's reconstructed accounts, but the shape is consistent. The sacrifice of his oldest rival's genetic legacy was the price, and the transformation that followed took him from the mortal form he had inhabited for centuries into something that the eye's geometry could accommodate more fully. He did not want daemonhood. This is one of the few things about the event that the sources consistently emphasize. Perturabo, who had wanted recognition and who had wanted to build and who had wanted the system to see what it had, did not want to become a being of the warp. He accepted it the way he had accepted every other outcome that his calculation told him was inevitable, because the alternative was not accepting, and the cost of not accepting was higher than the cost of accepting. The transaction was completed. The transformation was permanent. The daemon Primarch of the Iron Warriors sits on Medrengard. Sits is not the right word. Builds is the right word. He is building, still after 10,000 years, in the daemon world that contains his vision, and that grows as his vision expands, and that has become, in the centuries of its continuous construction, something that reflects Perturabo's mind as completely as the Thousand Suns planet of the sorcerers reflects Magnus's, or the Plague planet reflects Mortarion's. Medrengard is what Perturabo would have built if the Imperium had let him build. It is the answer to the question that Olympia first asked, and that 30 years of the Great Crusade left unanswered, and that 10,000 years of the Eye have finally given him the space and the material and the time to answer. Whether the answer was worth the cost of everything that had to be destroyed to clear the space for it is the question that the Iron Warrior's story asks, and that no one who examines the story honestly can answer with confidence. The Iron Warrior's raids into real space follow a pattern that the Ordo Malleus has documented extensively, and that the pattern's consistency makes it one of the more reliable threat assessment tools in the Inquisition's arsenal for predicting Iron Warriors' behavior. They do not raid for plunder in the way that some Traitor Legion warbands raid, striking at targets of opportunity and withdrawing before a response can be organized. They raid for objectives. The objectives are identified in advance, assessed for their strategic value within whatever larger campaign the warsmith directing the raid has been planning, and the raid is executed with the logistical preparation and the operational discipline that the Iron Warriors bring to everything. The siege of Hydrocaudatus demonstrated this with a clarity that the Imperium found deeply uncomfortable, because what it demonstrated was not simply the Iron Warriors' military capability, but the degree to which that capability could be directed at an objective that the Imperium considered invulnerable, and that the Iron Warriors, after proper assessment, did not. Hydrocaudatus was an Imperial Fist's fortress, a heavily fortified installation on a world in the Segmentum whose name carries the resonance that Imperial Fist's fortifications carry throughout the Imperium. The resonance of Rogel Dawn's engineering legacy, and the assurance that what Dawn's sons built was built to hold. The fortress guarded, among other things, a repository of gene seed, progenoid glands, the biological inheritance of the Imperial Fist's own genetic lineage, stored in the secure conditions that the chapter's apothecaries maintained, and that the fortress's defenses were supposed to keep safe against any threat the galaxy could produce. The warsmith who directed the assault on Hydrocaudatus was named Honsu. The name has entered the Ordo Malleus's files as one of the more notable Iron Warriors commanders of the current era, not because Honso's individual capabilities exceed those of other warsmiths, though they do not fall short, but because Honso's specific character illustrates something about what the Iron Warriors have become that the broader pattern of Iron Warriors' behavior sometimes obscures. Honso is a half-breed. His gene seed contains material from both Iron Warriors and Imperial Fist's stock, a contamination that the purists within the Iron Warriors' own ranks consider an abomination, and that Honso himself carries with an attitude that falls somewhere between defiance and indifference. He is what the Iron Warriors produce when the strict organizational purity that Perturabo's original culture maintained has been eroded by 10,000 years of the Eye's influence, and the practical necessities of maintaining force strength with imperfect resources. He is competent. He is vicious in the measured, purposeful way that Iron Warrior's viciousness expresses, which is the viciousness of a mind that has calculated the optimal level of force application for a given situation, and does not exceed that level, because exceeding it would be waste. And he has a chip on his shoulder the size of a titan, because the Iron Warrior's culture does not forgive impurity easily, and Honsu has spent his entire career fighting not only the enemies his warsmith status requires him to fight, but the internal resistance of a legion that considers him a lesser product of an impure process. He took Hydrocaudatus. The siege lasted weeks, conducted with the graduated application of force that Iron Warriors' doctrine prescribes, each phase building on the previous phase's results. The defenders' responses observed and analyzed and countered in real time by a force that understood siege warfare from both sides, and that was applying the attacker's side with total commitment. The Imperial Fist's garrison fought with the determination that their chapter's culture demanded and that Dawn's legacy inspired, holding positions that the Iron Warriors' calculated attrition was designed to make untenable, and holding them anyway because the Imperial Fists do not yield to the Iron Warriors. The refusal was personal. The history between these two legions made every meter of Hydrocaudatus personal in ways that had nothing to do with the tactical value of they. ground being contested and everything to do with 10,000 years of a rivalry that the heresy had converted from professional competition into permanent enmity. The gene seed was taken. The fortress fell. The Iron Warriors withdrew with the prize that the campaign had been built to acquire, carrying with them the genetic legacy of their oldest rival, the specific biological inheritance that connected the Imperial fists to Rogel Dawn, and that the Iron Warriors now possessed for whatever purpose the Warsmith intended. The purpose was practical. Gene seed is the mechanism by which Space Marine chapters reproduce, and the Iron Warriors, operating in the Eye of Terror without access to the stable recruiting worlds and the apothecary infrastructure that loyal chapters maintain, face a continuous demographic problem that their status as traitors prevents them from solving through conventional channels. They need warriors. Warriors require gene seed. Gene seed must come from somewhere. The Iron Warriors solve this problem the way they solve all problems, through engineering, applying the same pragmatic assessment to the question of biological reproduction that they apply to the question of fortification analysis. And the assessment produced the conclusion that stealing an enemy chapter's gene seed reserves was the most efficient available solution. The obliterators are worth discussing here because they represent something about the Iron Warriors' relationship to the warp that the broader description of their pragmatic detachment from chaos worship does not fully capture. An obliterator is a chaos space marine who has been infected by a techno-organic virus whose origin the Ordo Malleus has attributed to the warp's influence on the intersection between the biological and the mechanical. The infection transforms the warrior's body into something that is part flesh, part armor, part weapon, a being whose physical form can generate the tools of war from its own biological substrate, producing guns and blades and ammunition from the material of its own body in configurations that the warrior's mind directs. The Iron Warriors have more obliterators than any other traitor legion. This is not coincidence. The obliterator virus finds its most receptive hosts in warriors, whose relationship to the mechanical is already deep, and whose cultural attitude toward the modification of the body in service of capability is already permissive. The Iron Warrior's culture, which has always valued the functional over the aesthetic, and which has always treated the warrior's body as an instrument whose configuration should be optimized for the task rather than preserved for its own sake, provides the fertile ground that the virus needs. An Iron Warrior who becomes an obliterator has not, in the Iron Warrior's cultural framing, been corrupted. He has been optimized. The distinction between those two things is invisible from outside the culture and absolute from inside it. The daemon engines that the Iron Warriors deploy in their campaigns represent the same cultural logic applied to a different domain. A daemon engine is a war machine whose operational core is not a machine spirit in the Imperial sense, but a bound daemon, a warp entity trapped within the machine's physical structure and forced to animate it through the entity's own psychic energy. The Iron Warriors are among the most prolific producers and deployers of daemon engines in the traitor legions, not because their relationship to the warp is deeper than other legions, but because their engineering culture provides the technical framework for the binding process, and their pragmatic attitude toward the source of the power that makes things work provides the philosophical permission. A daemon is a power source. This is how the Iron Warriors' warpsmith cadre, those engineers who specialize in the integration of warp-born entities into mechanical systems, describe what they do. The daemon is not worshipped. The daemon is not offered devotion. The daemon is captured, constrained, and forced to perform a function, the same way that a conventional power source is captured, constrained, and directed toward a useful output. The binding process is not simple, and it is not safe, and the entities being bound are not passive participants in the arrangement, and the arrangement does not always hold. And the Iron Warriors who practice this craft have developed over millennia a body of technical knowledge about what works and what doesn't, and what the specific failure modes are, and how to mitigate the specific risks that the specific entities they are working with tend to produce. This is the Iron Warriors at their most philosophically coherent and their most deeply troubling. They have taken the thing that the rest of the galaxy fears most, the entities of the warp and the power those entities represent, and they have treated it as an engineering problem. They have reduced the metaphysical horror of daemonic presence to a question of binding strength and containment integrity and operational parameters, and they manage that question with the same competence they bring to every other question of engineering. And the management works well enough that the daemon engines the Iron Warriors deploy are among the most reliable and most effective in the Traitor Legion's arsenal. The horror is not in the daemon engines themselves, which are terrible enough in the conventional military sense. The horror is in what the daemon engines reveal about the Iron Warriors' relationship to everything. They are engineers. They have been engineers since Olympia. And the engineering mind, when it is sufficiently powerful and sufficiently disconnected from the values that would normally constrain the application of engineering capability, treats everything as material. Iron, stone, flesh, daemons, the tools of the craft are selected for their fitness for the purpose. And the moral status of the tools is not part of the selection criteria. The Iron Warriors do not think about whether it is right to bind a daemon in a machine. They think about whether the binding will hold, and whether the machine's output is worth the investment required to produce it. This is why the Iron Warriors are frightening in a way that is different from the way other traitor legions are frightening. The World Eaters are frightening because they are violent without limit. The Death Guard are frightening because they are walking plagues. The Emperor's children are frightening because their pursuit of sensation has removed every restraint that human biology normally imposes on human behavior. The Iron Warriors are frightening because they are competent, because they approach the business of war and siege and conquest with a level of professional skill that does not require passion or belief, or any of the emotional fuel that most military forces depend on for their motivation. They are the cold version. The version that does not need to be angry at you to kill you efficiently. The version that has calculated the optimal approach to your destruction and is executing the calculation without the energy waste of feeling anything about it. In the current era, the Iron Warriors' grand companies operate across the galaxy's conflict zones, with a presence that is felt less as the dramatic incursion of a chaos warband, and more as the gradual, methodical degradation of defensive positions that were supposed to hold. The Cadian Gate has seen Iron Warriors' pressure. The sectors adjacent to the Eye have felt the weight of Iron Warriors' siegecraft applied to their fortifications with the measured patience that the Iron Warriors have always brought to the long game. They do not announce themselves. They do not make the grand declarations that the word-bearers favor or the blood-soaked demands that the world-eaters prefer. They simply begin the siege, and the siege progresses, and the defenders discover over the weeks and months that follow that the force applying pressure to their walls understands those walls better than the defenders do, and that the understanding is being applied with a thoroughness that no amount of heroic resistance can indefinitely counter. The worlds that the Iron Warriors target are not random. The selection reflects the engineering mind applied to strategic planning, the assessment of which Imperial defensive positions represent the highest value targets in the context of whatever larger objective the warsmith directing the campaign has identified. They do not waste effort on targets that are not worth the expenditure required to reduce them. They do not pursue vengeance in the way that some warbands pursue it, returning to worlds that have resisted them in the past, in order to settle the score. Settling scores is an emotional expenditure that the Iron Warriors culture does not authorize. The next objective is the one that the assessment identifies as most valuable, regardless of what the previous objective was and regardless of how the previous campaign ended. There is a coldness to this that some observers mistake for discipline, and that the Iron Warriors themselves consider to be something other than discipline. Discipline implies a constraint imposed on natural impulses by an external framework of rules and consequences. The Iron Warriors' behavior does not feel from inside the culture like the suppression of natural impulses. It feels like the expression of them. The natural impulse of an Iron Warrior is to assess, to plan, to calculate, to execute the calculation with minimum waste. Emotion in this framework is waste. Rage is waste. Grief is waste. Devotion to the Chaos Gods is waste insofar as it consumes energy that could be directed toward operational objectives. The Iron Warriors have over 10,000 years built a culture that has removed the waste and left only the function, and the function is siege, and the siege is everything. Consider what it means to be an Iron Warrior. Not a warsmith, not a commander, not a figure of sufficient rank, that the strategic decisions of the Grand Company require his input. An ordinary Iron Warriors legionnaire, a space marine of the 4th Legion in the 10,000th year of the Long War, standing in the siege lines before a fortress that his warsmith has identified as the current objective, and that the engineering assessment has determined will fall in approximately 6 weeks at the current rate of degradation. He has been doing this for centuries. Not this specific siege, this activity. The activity of siege warfare applied to different targets on different worlds in different systems, each one a separate engineering problem with its own characteristics and its own optimal solution. Each one approached with the same methodology and the same tools and the same attitude. He has been standing in siege lines before fortresses and applying calculated attrition to their defenses for longer than most of the Imperium's current generation of fortress commanders have been alive. He knows fortifications the way the men inside them know their own names. He can tell you, from the sound of an artillery impact against a specific type of construction material, whether the round has penetrated the load-bearing structure or merely scarred the facing. He can read the behavior of a defensive garrison through the pattern of its counter-battery fire, and determine from that pattern alone how the garrison's morale is tracking, and how long it will take before the morale breaks. He does not hate the men inside the fortress. He does not love them He does not feel about them in any direction that would produce a response that the feeling itself, rather than the professional assessment, would direct. They are the occupants of a position that his engineering has been tasked with reducing. When the position falls and the occupants are dead or captured, he will move to the next position. The transition between the current objective and the next one does not involve reflection, or grief for the dead, or satisfaction with the accomplished. It involves logistics, the movement of equipment, the assessment of the next target's defensive characteristics, the beginning of the next calculation. He maintains his equipment with the care that the Iron Warrior's culture demands, which is the care of a craftsman who understands that tools must be in working order to perform their function, and that the maintenance of tools is not an aesthetic indulgence, but an operational necessity. His bolter is clean. His armor is repaired. The specific augmentations that centuries of Iron Warrior's service have added to his body, the mechanical enhancements and the bio-interface improvements and the specific sensor modifications that siege warfare's particular demands have produced, are maintained at the standard that the warsmith's inspection requires. He does not personalize his equipment the way that warriors of other legions personalize theirs, adding trophies and marks and the accumulated iconography of individual identity. The Iron Warrior's mark is the same mark: the iron skull, the hazard stripes, the identification of the Grand Company and the rank within it. Beyond these, the individual warrior is not encouraged to express himself through his equipment, because individual expression is not a category that Iron Warrior's culture values. He remembers Olympia, not directly, not as a personal memory, which would require him to have been alive 10,000 years ago, though some of the older Iron Warriors were, and some of them carry those memories with them in the specific heavy way that warriors carry memories of homeworlds that no longer exist. He remembers Olympia through the Legion's culture, through the stories and the practices and the engineering traditions that trace back to the city-states and the walls and the boy who could see the flaw in everything. The memory is not sentimental. Iron Warriors do not do sentiment. The memory is functional, the way that an engineering tradition's foundational principles are functional, informing current practice without requiring current practitioners to feel anything about the founders. He may have been recruited from a different world entirely. The Iron Warrior's post-heresy recruitment draws from wherever the Grand Company's current operations bring it into contact with populations that produce suitable candidates, and the candidates are assessed on criteria that the Iron Warriors, apothecaries and warsmiths have refined over millennia into a selection process whose efficiency is matched by its indifference to everything except the candidate's potential for the specific kind of service the Legion requires. Physical capability, psychological resilience, aptitude for the technical demands of siege warfare, the ability to function under sustained stress without the emotional degradation that sustained stress produces in most organic minds. The last criterion is perhaps the most important. The Iron Warriors select from whatever population they are recruiting from the individuals whose psychological architecture is most compatible with the experience of doing terrible things for extended periods, without the terrible things producing a psychological response that interferes with performance. This is not the absence of emotion. This is the specific management of emotion. the Iron Warriors culture having developed over 10,000 years the specific set of practices and attitudes that allow warriors to experience the emotional content of their activities without permitting that content to affect the activity's execution. An Iron Warrior can recognize that what he is doing is terrible. He can understand the scale of the suffering his actions are producing. He can perceive, with the intelligence that Perturabo's gene seed and the Legion's training have given him, the full moral dimensions of a siege conducted against a civilian population whose only offense was being located on a world that the Warsmith had identified as a useful objective. He perceives all of this. He continues. The continuation is not the triumph of will over conscience. It is the operation of a cultural framework that has placed the continuation of the work above the moral dimensions of the work's consequences, and that treats the moral dimensions not as constraints to be observed, but as noise to be filtered. The Daemonculaba, this must be addressed, because it is the thing about the Iron Warriors that the accounts of their activities in the current era tend to avoid for reasons that have less to do with classification and more to do with the difficulty of describing it in language that the description does not degrade. The Daemonculaba was Honso's creation, or Honso's implementation of a concept whose origin in Iron Warriors culture predates his command. A method of accelerated space marine production that addressed the Iron Warriors' demographic problem in the most direct and most grotesque way available. The gene seed implantation process that produces space marines from human candidates is, under normal circumstances, a long and carefully managed procedure with a significant failure rate. The Iron Warriors, operating without the stable infrastructure that the process normally requires, with gene seed stocks that the Eye of Terror's influence has degraded from their original specifications, and with the continuous operational demand for replacement warriors that an active campaign schedule produces, needed something faster. Onsu provided it. What he provided was a biological mechanism that used human women as living incubation chambers for accelerated gene seed development, a process that the Order Malleus documents, whose contents are relevant to this description, characterize with language that is deliberately clinical, and that the underlying reality makes the clinical language feel complicit in. It worked, in the narrow, terrible sense that it produced space marines at a rate that the conventional process could not match. It worked. The products were not identical to warriors produced through the normal implantation sequence. They were often flawed. They were sometimes unstable. They were always in some dimension that the process's engineering focus could not address, damaged by the specific nature of their creation in ways that the Iron Warriors' culture considered operationally irrelevant because the damage did not affect combat performance to a degree that the performance metrics could detect. The moral content of the Daemonculaba is not something the Iron Warriors engage with. The moral content is something that external observers react to with the specific revulsion that the description produces in beings who maintain the categories of moral assessment that the Iron Warriors' culture has filed under waste. The women used in the process, the candidates who did not survive it, the products who emerged from it changed in ways that no diagnostic could fully characterize. All of this is terrible. All of it is, from inside the Iron Warriors' assessment framework, an engineering problem solved to acceptable specifications within the constraints of available resources. This is the deepest horror of the Iron Warriors. Not the Daemonculaba itself, though the Daemonculaba is horrible. The deepest horror is the framework. The system of assessment that can look at the Daemonculaba and produce the conclusion that it is a viable solution to a resource allocation problem, and that the moral dimensions of the solution are not part of the assessment criteria. The Iron Warriors have built over 10,000 years a way of thinking about the world that removes from the assessment of actions the category of morality entirely. And the removal has been so complete and so thoroughly integrated into the culture that the culture does not experience the absence as an absence. It experiences it as efficiency. The Siege of Castellax is another entry in the Iron Warriors campaign history that illustrates the Legion's character through specific action rather than broad description. Castellax was an Iron Warriors fortress world, one of the strongholds that various warsmiths maintained as forward bases and production facilities in the regions they controlled. When it was attacked by an Orc war of sufficient size to threaten the installation's integrity, the Iron Warriors defending it responded in the manner that Iron Warriors respond to all threats to their fortifications, which was to calculate the defense and execute the calculation. What made Castellax instructive was not the battle itself, which followed Iron Warriors' defensive doctrine with the expected precision, but the relationship between the Iron Warriors' garrison and the human slave population that the fortress's operations depended on. The slaves worked the factories. They maintained the systems. They performed the 1,000 tasks that the running of a fortress-scale installation requires, and that the Iron Warriors themselves could not perform in sufficient numbers, because their numbers were limited by the demographic constraints that the Iron Warriors' existence in the Eye imposed. The slaves were not treated well. This is an understatement that the conditions on Castellax make almost laughably inadequate. They were treated as components, replaceable, maintainable, subject to the same assessment of continued utility that the Iron Warriors applied to their ammunition stocks and their vehicle maintenance schedules. When the Orc assault threatened the fortress, the Iron Warriors' defensive calculation included the slave population as a variable, not as people to be protected, as a resource to be allocated. Some were put to work on the defenses. Some were armed inadequately and placed in positions where their contribution to the defensive effort was measured not in the kills they would produce, but in the time they would buy. The seconds and minutes of the Orc advance that their bodies would absorb before the Orcs pushed through them and reached the positions that the Iron Warriors were actually defending. The slaves fought because there was nothing else to do. Some of them fought with a courage that surprised the Iron Warriors observing them, which is an observation that says more about what the Iron Warriors expected from their slaves than about the slaves themselves. They died in the numbers that the defensive calculation had predicted, and Castellax fell anyway. The Orc War was larger than the garrison could sustain against, and the Iron Warriors were driven from the fortress world they had built. Their grand company reduced to a fraction of its former strength, the survivors withdrawing with a vow to reclaim what they had lost. The calculation had been accurate. The forces had simply been insufficient to produce a different outcome. The Iron Warriors processed the loss the way they process everything, as data, not as defeat, as information to be incorporated into the next calculation. The Iron Warriors of the current era have not changed from the Iron Warriors of the Heresy in any fundamental dimension. The warp has changed their bodies. The Eye has changed their material circumstances. 10,000 years have accumulated the specific modifications and adaptations that 10,000 years of existence in conditions of continuous siege warfare produce. But the character is the same. The engineering mind, the calculated approach to every problem, the removal of the emotional response from the assessment process, the commitment to the work above all other commitments. They are still building. In the siege lines and in the Eye and on Medrengard and in every Grand Company's forward operating base, the Iron Warriors are building. Because building is what they do, and what they have always done, and what Perturabo's gene seed keeps producing in every warrior who carries it. They build fortifications. They build siege works. They build daemon engines and war machines and the logistical infrastructure of campaigns that may last decades. They build with the excellence that Perturabo demanded of them before the heresy, and that the heresy did not change, and that 10,000 years of the Eye have not degraded. They just do not build the things that Perturabo wanted to build when he was a boy on Olympia, looking at the walls of Damekos' city, and seeing not just the walls but everything they could be, every improvement they could receive, every way they could serve the people who lived inside them as well as the people who defended them. That boy is gone. What replaced him is a daemon Primarch on a throne of iron, in a fortress of the damned, building forever in a dimension where the building never finishes, and the finished building never serves anyone except the mind that designed it. The Imperium that broke him is still out there, still running the same machinery that broke him, still assigning the unglamorous work to the formations that are best at it, and still failing to recognize that the people doing that work might need the recognition as much as they need the assignment. The commissars who read the Iron Warriors' operational files in the Departamento Munitorum's archives, if they are the kind of commissars who think about what they are reading rather than simply filing it, sometimes notice something uncomfortable in the pattern. The pattern of the Iron Warriors' fall does not look like corruption in the ordinary sense. It does not look like weakness exploited or faith misdirected or rage unleashed. It looks like management failure. It looks like what happens when an institution possesses a resource of extraordinary value and treats it as ordinary, and applies it without recognition, and loses it not to any external enemy, but to its own inability to see what it had. The Departamento Munitorum does not draw this conclusion officially. Drawing it would require the institution to examine its own practices with a self-awareness that the institution's structural design does not facilitate. But the conclusion is there in the files, in the pattern, in the specific arc that leads from a boy who loved to build to a daemon Primarch who builds forever in the dark. The Imperium broke the Iron Warriors. The Chaos Gods simply collected what was left. Every traitor legion holds up a mirror to the Imperium. The word bearers reflect the Imperium's relationship to faith. The World Eaters reflect the Imperium's relationship to violence. The Death Guard reflect the Imperium's relationship to endurance, and the cost of pushing endurance past the point where it stops being a virtue. Each fallen legion, in its specific and terrible way, demonstrates what happens when one of the Imperium's defining qualities is taken to its extreme and pushed past the boundary where the quality stops being functional and becomes its own destruction. The Iron Warriors hold up the mirror that nobody in the Imperium wants to look into, because the reflection it shows is not the image of a glamorous vice or a dramatic failure. It is the image of a system that does not see what it has until it has lost it, and that does not learn from the loss because the system does not have the mechanism to learn from that category of loss. The Iron Warriors are the Imperium's own neglect made manifest. They are what the administrative machinery of a civilization produces when it is efficient enough to identify and deploy its most capable assets and too vast and too bureaucratically constrained to recognize that the deployment itself, without recognition, without the specific human feedback that tells a person their work is seen and valued, will eventually break the asset it is deploying. Perturabo's ledger, that private document of grievances that he maintained across 3 decades of the Great Crusade, adding entries with the methodical precision that he brought to everything, is the Iron Warrior's founding text more surely than any formal declaration of purpose or philosophical manifesto. It is a bureaucratic document, a record of inputs and outputs, of assignments given and recognition received, of a system's performance measured against the specific criteria that the person being served by the system considered relevant. It reads, in the fragments that the Ordo Hereticus has been able to reconstruct from Iron Warriors' sources captured over the millennia, like a performance review written by someone who has been consistently performing at the highest level and consistently receiving the feedback that their performance is adequate rather than exceptional. Adequate is the word that kills. Not failing, not insufficient. Adequate, meeting the baseline expectation without exceeding it, as far as the system's measurement tools can detect. The Iron Warriors were adequate. They did what they were asked. They did it well enough that the Crusade's operational machinery kept assigning them work of the same kind, which is what operational machinery does with assets that perform their assigned functions at the specified level of adequacy. It continues to assign them because the assignment is being executed and the system does not have the mechanism to distinguish between adequate execution and excellent execution, performed by a being who is dying inside from the inadequacy of the recognition. This pattern exists in the Imperium today, not in the form of a single Primarch maintaining a private ledger of grievances, in the form of the institutional culture itself, the vast administrative machinery that processes billions of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of worlds, and that measures its performance in the only terms its measurement tools can capture, which are the terms of outputs produced and objectives achieved, and the terms that measure whether the thing was done, rather than how the doing of it felt to the person doing it. The Departamento Munitorum does not ask its regiments whether the assignment was meaningful. The Administratum does not ask its adepts whether the work was fulfilling. The machinery runs. The inputs are processed, the outputs are produced, and the people who make the machinery work are, for the most part, never told that what they do matters beyond the minimum threshold of the assignment's completion. The death cause of Krieg accepted this. They accepted the absence of recognition as part of the absence of everything that their theology of atonement has conditioned them to expect. The Iron Warriors did not accept it. They maintained beneath the surface of their professional competence the awareness that the absence was present and that the presence of the absence was unjust. And the awareness accumulated over decades into something that the system's own indifference had created and that the system's own indifference could not address. There is a question buried in the Iron Warriors' history that the Imperium's institutional culture has been failing to ask for 10,000 years. and the failure to ask it is itself a form of answer. The question is whether the system produces what the Iron Warriors became, not whether specific individuals fall to chaos for specific reasons in specific circumstances, whether the system, the vast institutional machinery of the Imperium's military and administrative apparatus, produces, as a regular and predictable output, beings whose capabilities have been exploited, and whose humanity has been neglected, and whose resulting resentment has been left unaddressed long enough to become the kind of structural weakness that the Chaos Gods can exploit. The answer is yes. The system produces this. The system has been producing this for 10,000 years in the Iron Warriors, and in the thousands of smaller, less dramatic versions of the same pattern that play out across the Imperium's military and administrative hierarchies every standard year. Soldiers who serve without recognition, officers whose capabilities are deployed without acknowledgement, institutions whose contributions are treated as baseline rather than excellence. The specific grinding devaluation of competence that a system built for scale and efficiency produces as an unintended side effect of its own functioning. Because the system does not have a metric for recognition, and therefore does not track it, and therefore does not correct for its absence. The Chaos Gods watch this. They watch it with the patience that has always been their defining operational characteristic. They do not need to create the resentment. The system creates the resentment. The Chaos Gods need only to be present when the resentment reaches the point where it can be used, which is the specific moment when the being experiencing it has concluded that the system will not change, and that the only remaining options are to accept the injustice, or to break from the system entirely. Perturabo broke. 3 million Olympians and 1 sister, and a decimated legion, and the last bridge in cinders behind him, and the road ahead leading to the only place the road could lead, which was to Horus, and to the Eye, and to 10,000 years of building things that serve no one except the mind that designs them. The Imperium learned nothing. This is the hardest line in the entire story, and it is the truest one. The Imperium lost one of its most capable assets, lost him through the most preventable mechanism in its entire catalogue of losses. And the loss did not produce a revision of the system that had caused it. The Departamento Munitorum continues to assign its most capable formations to its least recognized work. The Administratum continues to process its assets through the machinery of deployment without the feedback loop that would allow the machinery to detect and correct for the human cost of its own efficiency. The system that broke Perturabo is the same system that is running now, in the 41st millennium, in the era of the Great Rift and the Noctis Aeterna, and all the other crises that the galaxy has produced since the Heresy, and that the Imperium is attempting to manage with tools that are, in important ways, the same tools that failed to manage the specific crisis of the Fourth Legions. Resentment. Some Inquisitors see this. The Ordo Malleus maintains intelligence files on the Iron Warriors that include, in their analytical appendices, observations about the systemic nature of the conditions that produced the Iron Warriors' fall, and about the degree to which those conditions remain present in the Imperium's current institutional culture. The observations are marked for limited distribution. They are not incorporated into the operational guidance that the Departamento Munitorum uses to manage its own forces. They sit in the analytical appendices, because the analytical appendices are where observations that are true but operationally inconvenient go to be preserved without being acted on. The Iron Warriors are the Imperium's specific and personal failure, not the Emperor's failure, though the Emperor's silence contributed. Not the Chaos God's victory, though the Chaos Gods profited. The Imperium's failure, the institutional failure of a civilization that could build the greatest military force in galactic history, and could not build the recognition structure that would have kept one of its most important members from concluding correctly that the institution he served did not value what he gave it. This is not a comfortable analysis. It is the kind of analysis that the people responsible for the system would prefer not to hear, because hearing it requires acknowledging that the system has a flaw of this category, and that the flaw is not a deviation from the system's design but a feature of it. The Imperium was not designed to recognize individual contribution at the Primarch level. It was designed by a being who managed everything from a position of overwhelming personal capability, and who assumed, not unreasonably given his own character, that the people beneath him in the hierarchy would manage themselves with similar capability and similar emotional self-sufficiency. The Emperor did not need to be told his work was valued. He knew its value. The assumption that his sons would function with the same self-knowledge was an assumption that the Emperor's specific character made natural, and that the Primarch's varying characters made incorrect. Perturabo needed. That is the simplest version. He needed to be seen by a father who was not looking. He needed his work to be acknowledged by a system that did not have the mechanism for acknowledgement. He needed to hear that what he built was worth building from the people whose authority to make that judgment he respected, and those people were the Emperor and the system the Emperor had created. And neither of them said it, and the silence lasted for 30 years, and the silence did the rest. The Chaos Gods did not break Perturabo. The Emperor did not break Perturabo. The system broke Perturabo. The vast, impersonal, administratively efficient, recognition-incapable system of the Great Crusade's military hierarchy broke one of its most valuable members through the sustained application of institutional indifference. And the breaking produced the Iron Warriors we have today. Those cold and capable siege engineers fighting their long war in the eye of terror and in the real space approaches to every Imperial fortress world that the Warsmith's assessment identifies as the next optimal target. The Iron Warriors are what the Imperium makes when it does not see what it has. They are the shadow of the Imperium's own efficiency, the cost of running a civilization at scale without the specific, expensive, operationally inconvenient work of making the people who run it feel that they matter. They are the answer to a question the Imperium has never asked, and the answer is that competence is not a substitute for connection, and that a system that treats its most capable members as resources rather than as people will eventually discover that resources do not maintain themselves indefinitely without something that the resource allocation framework does not have a line item for. Perturabo's relationships with his brothers were, with rare exceptions, defined by the distance that his character created, and that their responses to his character reinforced. The distance was not uniform. Different brothers hit different angles of Perturabo's internal architecture and produced different qualities of response. And understanding these relationships illuminates the Lord of Iron in ways that the broader narrative of resentment and neglect sometimes obscures. Horus was the one Perturabo almost trusted. The War Master. whose genius for interpersonal connection was among the most remarkable of his many remarkable capabilities, had identified Perturabo's wound early and had responded to it not by trying to heal it, which would have required the specific vulnerability that Perturabo's armor was designed to prevent, but by treating it as irrelevant. Horus gave Perturabo difficult assignments and acknowledged the difficulty. He spoke to the Lord of Iron as an equal whose capabilities he valued and whose contributions he tracked with the awareness that Perturabo craved and that the system's broader machinery had never provided. Whether this was genuine warmth or the most sophisticated form of management the Crusade possessed is, again, a question that says more about the asker than about Horus. Both things were true. Horus was warm and he was managing. Perturabo was valued and he was being used. The two things coexisted because the relationship was real and the manipulation was also real. And in a galaxy where the distinction between genuine connection and expert manipulation was already dangerously thin, Horus walked the line with the specific grace that made him the most effective leader of his age. When Horus turned, the relationship that had been the nearest thing to warmth in Perturabo's professional life became the mechanism by which that warmth was directed toward the rebellion. Horus did not need to seduce Perturabo. He needed only to continue being what he had been, the one person whose recognition had felt real, and to extend that recognition into the new context that the rebellion had created. Come with me, build for me what you were never allowed to build for him. The offer was not explicit. Horus did not frame it as a transaction. He simply continued to treat Perturabo as Perturabo wanted to be treated, and the treatment, which had been manipulative even before Davin, though it had also been genuine, continued to work, because the need it answered was the same need regardless of which side of the heresy the answering was being done from. Guilliman was the brother Perturabo should have been closest to, and was not, because the specific overlap in their capabilities produced competition rather than collaboration. Both of them were builders. Both of them thought in systems. Both of them had the capability to look at a civilization and see its structural requirements and design the solutions that those requirements demanded. Guilliman built institutions, Perturabo built fortifications. The two forms of building were not identical, but they were cognate. Two expressions of the same fundamental impulse toward the creation of structures that outlasted the moment and that served the people who used them. In a different story, with a different assignment pattern and a different recognition culture, they might have been the partnership that reconstructed the Imperium's post-Crusade infrastructure into something genuinely sustainable. Instead, they were the two Primarchs most likely to argue about the correct approach to an engineering problem, and least likely to resolve the argument productively, because the argument was never about the engineering. It was about whose engineering the system valued, and the system's answer, delivered through the specific assignment of the Terror Commission and 100 other allocation decisions, was consistently Guilliman and Dawn over Perturabo. Vulcan was the brother. Perturabo might have understood if understanding had been something Perturabo's armor permitted from beings he had not already classified as safe. Vulcan was a craftsman. His salamanders made their war gear by hand, each weapon and each suit of armor, the product of individual skill applied to individual materials. and the resulting quality was extraordinary in a way that mass production could not replicate. Vulcan understood the relationship between the maker and the made that Perturabo had felt since Olympia. The specific satisfaction of applying intelligence to material and producing something that had not existed before. They spoke the same language. They could not speak it to each other because Perturabo had decided somewhere in the decades of the Crusade that speaking it to anyone required lowering the wall, and the wall was not going to come down for anyone. Vulcan tried. The accounts of the period suggest that Vulcan, whose empathy was among the most genuine of any Primarchs, recognized what was happening to his brother and attempted to reach him. The attempts were met with the specific cold competence that Perturabo deployed against everything that approached the wall from outside. Vulcan eventually stopped trying. Perturabo did not notice, or noticed, and did not permit himself to care. The list could continue. The relationship with each brother was a variation on the theme, a different angle of approach to the same wall, a different discovery that the wall was very well built and that the builder was not interested in providing a gate. The result, accumulated across 20 relationships with the only beings in the galaxy who were Perturabo's true peers, was an isolation so complete that by the time of Olympia's destruction, there was not a single person outside the Iron Warrior's own structure who had the kind of relationship with Perturabo that might have provided the alternative to what happened. Caliphone was the last. Caliphone was always the last. The Honso Wars, the term that the Ordo Malleus uses informally to describe the sequence of campaigns that Honso's Grand Company conducted across the Segmentum Obscurus and Segmentum Tempestus in the years following the fall of Hydra Caudatus, demonstrate what an Iron Warrior's warsmith can accomplish when the combination of resources, capability, and motivation aligns to produce sustained offensive pressure against Imperial positions that were not prepared for the specific quality of threat the Iron Warriors represent. After Hydra Caudatus, Honso's name entered the Ordo Malleus's active threat registers at a priority level that reflected not just the strategic significance of what he had taken, but the demonstrated capability he had shown in taking it. He had breached an Imperial Fist's fortress with Chaos Space Marine forces that were outnumbered and outgunned on paper, and that had succeeded through the application of Iron Warrior's siege doctrine to the specific weaknesses that the doctrine was designed to identify. The gene seed he had captured gave him the raw material for force expansion. The reputation he had earned among the Iron Warriors' grand companies gave him the political capital to attract additional forces from warsmiths who calculated that alliance with a rising commander was a better investment than competition with one. He used both. The campaigns that followed Hydra Caudatus ranged across multiple sectors and struck at targets whose selection demonstrated the Iron Warrior's characteristic approach to strategic planning. The identification of objectives whose fall would produce cascading effects on the broader Imperial defensive architecture of the region. A supply depot whose destruction forced the redistribution of resources from a nearby fortress world. A communications relay whose neutralization isolated a subsector from its command authority for weeks. A garrison world whose reduction demonstrated to the surrounding systems that the Iron Warriors could reach them if the operational assessment determined they were worth reaching. The Imperium's response was complicated by the nature of the threat. The Iron Warriors did not stay. They were not building an empire in the conventional sense. They were conducting a campaign of strategic attrition, each operation designed to produce effects that served the next operation's requirements. The whole sequence building toward an objective that the Imperium's strategic intelligence analysts struggled to identify, because the Iron Warriors' planning horizon extended further than the analysts' available data could project. Honshu was eventually stopped. Not definitively, not in the way that a decisive battle produces a conclusion that both sides can organize their subsequent behavior around. He was contained by the specific combination of Space Marine intervention and the operational cost that sustained campaigning in hostile territory eventually produces even for forces as logistically competent as the Iron Warriors. He withdrew. He rebuilt. He planned the next sequence. This is the Iron Warriors pattern, not the dramatic single-stroke campaign that produces a climactic battle and a decisive outcome, but the long-term sequence of operations whose effects accumulate over time the way that geological pressure accumulates, producing change that is not visible on any single day but that is transformative across decades. The Iron Warriors in the era of the Great Rift are positioned, from the Order Malleus's analytical perspective, as one of the more concerning Traitor Legion threats in the current threat environment. Not the most dramatic, not the threat that produces the most immediate crisis in the systems it targets. The threat that is most difficult to defend against with the tools the Imperium currently possesses, because the Iron Warriors' operational methodology is specifically designed to counter the Imperium's defensive doctrine, and because the defensive doctrine has not been significantly revised since the Iron Warriors helped design the predecessors of the current version. The Imperium's fortifications are, in many cases, built on principles that the Iron Warriors understand better than the people defending them. This is not an abstract concern. It is an operational reality that fortress commanders across the segmentum obscurus live with. The awareness that the next siege may be conducted by a force that can identify the weaknesses in their defensive architecture more quickly than they can identify and address those weaknesses themselves. Because the force conducting the siege has been studying fortifications for 10,000 years, longer than the force defending them, and because the study has been conducted by minds whose gift for this work is written into their gene seed. Some commanders have attempted to innovate. Fortress designs that deviate from the standard templates. Defensive configurations that introduce unpredictability into the geometry that the Iron Warriors' doctrine is calibrated to exploit. These innovations are valuable. They are also temporary, because the Iron Warriors' response to innovation is not confusion but adaptation. An Iron Warriors siege force that encounters an unfamiliar defensive configuration treats the unfamiliarity as information to be gathered and processed rather than as a problem that prevents the siege from proceeding. The gathering takes time. The processing takes time. The siege proceeds with the modified approach that the processing produces. The innovation has bought time. It has not bought security. Time is what the Imperium buys against the Iron Warriors, not victory in the absolute sense, not the conclusive defeat that removes the threat from the strategic picture. Time, the delay that allows reinforcement to arrive or circumstances to change or the Iron Warriors' own operational requirements to redirect them toward a different target. The Imperium wins against the Iron Warriors by surviving the siege long enough for something else to intervene, which is not the same as winning. and which the Iron Warriors understand perfectly well, which is why their sieges are designed to conclude before the something else arrives. The race between the siege and the response is the operational dynamic that defines Iron Warriors' campaigns in the current era, and the race is run differently on every world it is run on, because the variables are different, and the Iron Warriors' assessment of those variables is different, and the plan that the assessment produces is different. The constant is the professionalism. The constant is the cold, measured, comprehensive application of siege doctrine to the defensive problem that the target world presents. The constant is the Iron Warriors doing what they have always done, applying the engineering mind to the reduction of whatever stands between them and the objective, with the total commitment and the total absence of emotional investment that the engineering mind, freed from every constraint except the work, produces. The constant is the iron, not the metal. The quality, the hardness that does not yield and that does not need to yield, because the hardness itself is the point. The Iron Warriors are iron in the way that their name promises, shaped by pressure and heat into something that serves the purpose it was made for, without the softness that makes other things easier to live with and easier to break. They are hard. They are capable. They are cold, and they are doing the thing they were built to do, with the excellence that Perturabo designed into them, on a scale that 10,000 years of practice has refined into something that the galaxy's defenders can contain but not counter, and can survive but not stop. The iron endures. That was always Perturabo's gift. Not the genius, though the genius was real. Not the vision, though the vision was extraordinary. The endurance. The capacity to continue, through neglect and through injustice and through the specific grinding weight of being consistently undervalued by a system that depended on him, without the endurance diminishing the quality of the work. The iron endures. The work continues. The siege is always somewhere against someone, advancing at the measured pace that the calculation prescribes. There is a moment in the history of the Iron Warriors that no account of them should pass without pausing at, because it is the moment that contains everything the rest of the story is an elaboration of. It is not the destruction of Olympia. It is not the Iron Cage. It is not the building of Medrengard, or the ascension to daemonhood. It is the moment, somewhere in the early decades of the Great Crusade, before any of the events that the history remembers had occurred, when Perturabo completed a campaign and received his next assignment, and the assignment was another siege, and the acknowledgement of the previous campaign was adequate, and the boy from Olympia who loved to build felt, for the first time clearly, the specific weight of a future that contained nothing except more of the same. That moment. The moment when a mind capable of seeing the structure of anything looked at the structure of its own situation and saw with total clarity that the situation was not going to change. Not because of any specific failure or injustice, because of the nature of the system itself, which was vast and impersonal and designed to optimize the deployment of assets rather than the fulfillment of persons, and which had no mechanism for distinguishing between the adequate performance of an asset and the slow suffocation of the intelligence that the asset contained. The moment is not dramatic. There is no confrontation with a brother, no kneeling in ashes, no voice from the warp offering an alternative. There is simply the understanding, arriving quietly and without fanfare. settling into the architecture of a mind that was already building around it before it had fully arrived. That the thing Perturabo wanted most from the system he served was not something the system could provide. Not because the system was malicious. Because the system did not have the category. Recognition of the kind Perturabo needed existed in the vocabulary of individual relationships, in the language of fathers and sons and brothers, but not in the vocabulary of institutions. Not in the formal channels through which the Crusade's hierarchy communicated with its components. The system could assign Perturabo a siege. It could not tell him that his siege mattered. From that moment forward, everything Perturabo did was the behavior of a man who had received a diagnosis and was managing the symptoms without treating the disease. The ledger was a symptom. The coldness was a symptom. The wall around his personality that repelled the approaches of brothers who might have offered what the system could not was a symptom. The professional excellence that continued undiminished through the 30 years of growing resentment was a symptom. Because Perturabo's commitment to the quality of his work was not contingent on the quality being seen, and the lack of contingency was itself the evidence that the man had separated the work from its meaning, and was continuing to produce the work in the absence of the meaning. This is what the Emperor broke. Not Perturabo's capability, not his loyalty in the narrow sense of his willingness to follow orders and produce results. His connection to the purpose that the capability was supposed to serve. The Emperor built the Great Crusade around a dream of human civilization restored, a species unified and capable and facing the future with the combined strength of its greatest works. Perturabo had shared that dream. He had built for it, literally, with his hands and his mind and the lives of the warriors who followed him into the grinding work that the dream's implementation required. And the dream's machinery had treated his building as adequate, had looked at the greatest siege engineer in the galaxy, producing results that no other Primarch could replicate, and had filed him under satisfactory without the specific acknowledgement that would have told him his building was part of the dream rather than merely its infrastructure. The infrastructure is never the dream. This is the lesson. The people who build the systems that make the dream possible are not, in the dream's own self-presentation, the dream's protagonists. They are its support structure. And support structures are maintained and deployed and replaced when they fail, and the system that maintains and deploys and replaces them does not experience their contribution as part of the dream's emotional content, because the system does not have an emotional content. The system has outputs. The dream has meaning. The gap between the two is where Perturabo lived for 30 years. And the gap is where the Iron Warriors live today. And the gap has not been closed by 10,000 years of the Imperium's continued operation, because the Imperium does not know the gap is there. The Iron Warriors are the Imperium's confession, not intentionally. Not in any way that the Imperium would acknowledge if the framing were presented to it, but the existence of the Fourth Legion in its current form. The cold professional siege engineers fighting the long war from the Eye of Terror, and the real space approaches to Imperial space, is a confession of what the Imperium's own system produces when its operating conditions are maintained long enough. The confession says, we had the best siege engineer in the history of the species, and we gave him the siege and did not give him the seeing, and the siege without the seeing produced this. The Imperium does not read its own confessions. The Iron Warriors are there anyway, in the siege lines with the iron and the patience and the cold, and the confession continues whether or not anyone reads it. Perturabo builds on Medrengard. He has been building for 10,000 years without interruption, in a daemon world whose geometry accommodates everything his mind can produce, in a space where the constraints that the Imperium placed on his creativity no longer apply, and the only constraint is the mind itself, and the mind has no constraints, because the mind was always larger than any single project, and the eye provides projects without limit. He builds walls within walls. Within walls, he builds things that the warp's proximity allows, and that real space would not have tolerated. He builds with the total commitment of a being who has finally, after 10,000 years, been given the space and the time and the material to answer the question that Olympia first asked, which was what happens when this mind builds without limitation. The answer is Medrengard. The answer is also the question, because Medrengard is never finished. The building continues. The question continues. The answer that the building produces is always the beginning of the next answer, which is always the beginning of the next project, which is always the beginning of the next expression of a capability that has no endpoint, because the capability itself was never the problem. The problem was always that the capability was deployed without the connection that would have given the deployment its meaning, and meaning is not something that capability can produce on its own, regardless of how much of it there is. Perturabo has everything he wanted. He has the unlimited creative freedom that Olympia never gave him, and that the Crusade's assignment structure denied him. He has the material and the time and the space. He has the absence of the system that constrained him. And he has, in the specific and devastating way that getting what you wanted can demonstrate that what you wanted was not the actual thing you needed. The evidence that unlimited creative freedom in the absence of connection to the purpose the creation serves is not fulfillment. It is activity. It is the most sophisticated form of keeping busy that a daemon Primarch's resources can produce. It is not the thing. The thing was always Olympia. The thing was always the boy looking at the wall and seeing how to make it better and wanting, with the uncomplicated wanting of a mind encountering its own purpose for the first time, to make it better for the people who lived behind it, the water supply improvements, the irrigation designs, the civilian projects that Mekos redirected toward military applications, and that the Crusade redirected toward siege warfare, and that the Iron Warriors' post-heresy existence redirected toward the cold professional destruction of everything they were capable of building. The thing was building for the people, for the civilization, for the dream that the Emperor had, and that Perturabo had shared before the sharing was made conditional on the sharing being recognized, and the recognition did not come. The boy is gone. The daemon Primarch builds. The Iron Warriors siege. The galaxy turns, and somewhere in the Departamento Munitorum's archives, in the specific files that track the 4th Legion's operational history, and that the most thorough of the Inquisition's analytical staff occasionally review for patterns, the ledger continues. Not Perturabo's private ledger of grievances, the Imperium's own ledger, the one that tracks what the system produces and what it costs, and what the produced and the cost tell you about the nature of the system doing the producing. The ledger says that the system works, the outputs are maintained, the sieges are conducted, The campaigns achieve their objectives. The cost is within the acceptable parameters. The system is functioning. The ledger does not say that one of its most valuable components is missing. The ledger does not have a line for that. The ledger does not have a line for the things that the system broke by running correctly, because the system running correctly is not, in the ledger's framework, a cause of breakage. Breakage comes from failure. Breakage comes from error. Breakage does not come from a system that assigns its best siege engineer to the siege that needs doing, and does not tell him that the doing matters, except when it does. Except when the system produces, as a regular and predictable output of its own correct functioning, a Perturabo, a being of extraordinary capability whose capability was exploited and whose humanity was neglected and whose resulting resentment was left to accumulate for 30 years until it became the structural weakness that the Chaos Gods did not need to create because the system had created it for them. The Iron Warriors are the system's output, the cold, the competent, the professional, the measuring of everything in terms of function and the filing of everything else under waste, the building that never stops, and the connection that was never established, and the 10,000 years of siege that fills the space where the connection would have been if anyone in a position of authority had looked at the boy from Olympia and said, "What you build is extraordinary. What you build matters. We see you." They did not say it. He is gone. The iron endures. And the system that produced the absence continues to produce it across 10,000 years and 1,000,000 worlds, in every regiment that receives its assignment without recognition, and every officer whose capabilities are deployed without acknowledgement. The system runs. The outputs are maintained. The cost accumulates in ledgers that nobody reads, because the ledgers are private and the people keeping them have learned, from the example of the Lord of Iron, that submitting them achieves nothing that not submitting them would not have achieved equally well. The Iron Warriors know this. They have always known it. The knowing is the iron. The Iron Warriors' contribution to the Horus Heresy was, characteristically, the contribution that made everyone else's contribution possible while receiving the least attention in the histories that recorded it. The other traitor legions fought the campaigns that the heresy's narrative remembers. The word-bearers at Kauth, the world-eaters across the Shadow Crusade, the Emperor's children in their spiraling descent into sensation worship that made them simultaneously more dangerous and less reliable with every passing month. The Iron Warriors did the other thing. They held what needed holding. They took what needed taking. They built the siege works that other legions fought from and maintained the logistics networks that other legions depended on and performed, in the specific context of a galactic civil war, the same role they had performed during the Great Crusade, which was the unglamorous essential work that nobody celebrated and nobody could do without. The relationship between the Iron Warriors and the other traitor legions during the heresy was defined by the same dynamic that had defined their relationship with the loyal legions during the Crusade, which was the dynamic of a force whose professional capability was respected at the operational level, and whose cultural identity was not respected at any level. The World Eaters needed siege works from which to launch their assaults, and the Iron Warriors provided them, and the World Eaters used them, and the World Eaters did not acknowledge the provision. The Death Guard needed fortified positions to anchor their defensive operations, and the Iron Warriors built them, and the Death Guard occupied them, and the occupation was the end of the transaction. The Emperor's children needed infrastructure for their increasingly bizarre logistical requirements, and the Iron Warriors provided it because providing it was part of the operational plan. And the Iron Warriors do not refuse operational assignments because the assignment's recipient is insufficiently grateful. The resentment that this produced in the Iron Warriors' ranks was not the dramatic resentment of warriors who feel themselves mistreated and who express that feeling in ways that produce visible consequences. It was the quiet resentment of professionals who have noticed a pattern and who are maintaining their own internal accounting of it while continuing to perform at the level their professional standards demand. The Iron Warriors during the Heresy did not complain about their assignments. They completed them. They completed them with excellence, and the completion, performed without complaint and without recognition, deepened the culture of cold professionalism that the Heresy was accelerating in the Iron Warrior's character. Because each unrewarded excellence was another data point in the cultural dataset that said, the work is the only thing that matters. Because the work is the only thing that is consistently present regardless of the context. The Battle of Fall is worth noting as one of the Heresy-era engagements that complicated the narrative of Perturabo's infallibility. An Imperial Fist's retribution fleet originally dispatched by dawn toward the Istvan system had become becalmed by warp storms in the Fall system. For 141 days they waited, drilling and preparing, kept at a state of constant battle readiness by their commander, Captain Alexis Pollux. Horus dispatched the Iron Warriors to intercept and destroy this fleet before it could reach Terra. Perturabo arrived expecting an easy engagement against a stranded force. He found something else. Pollux had prepared well, and the Imperial Fist's fleet fought with a discipline and readiness that the Iron Warriors' initial assault could not overcome. The battle went poorly for Perturabo. Despite outnumbering the Imperial Fists, the Iron Warriors suffered substantial losses, Pollux's preparation turning what should have been an ambush into a grinding naval engagement that the Iron Warriors were not winning. Dawn's recall order reached Pollux before the engagement could be decided. The Imperial Fists withdrew toward Terra, obeying their Primarch's command with the immediate obedience that the Imperial Fist's culture demanded even when the tactical situation might have favored staying. Perturabo was left in the Fall system, having failed to destroy the fleet he had been sent to intercept, nursing losses that his legion could not easily replace, and carrying the knowledge that an Imperial Fist's captain with a becalmed fleet had fought him to a standstill. The ledger gained another entry, though this one was written in a different ink. During the siege of Terra itself, Perturabo's role was broader than simple command of the Iron Warriors' siege elements. Horus had recognized what the Emperor had not, which was that Perturabo's capability extended beyond the tactical domain of fortification analysis into the strategic domain of campaign design. The Lord of Iron was given significant authority over the coordination of the entire siege's engineering effort, not just the Iron Warriors' contribution, but the integration of the various traitor legion forces into a coherent assault plan that addressed the palace's defenses as a single complex problem rather than as a collection of individual positions to be attacked separately. He designed the trenches, he designed the approach sequences. He calculated the bombardment patterns that would degrade the specific sections of Dawn's walls that his analysis had identified as the highest value targets. He coordinated the Daemon engines and the Titan forces, and the mass infantry assaults in patterns that each reinforced the other's effects. For the first time in his career, the full scope of Perturabo's capability was being applied to a single objective by a command authority that had given him the operational freedom to apply it without constraint. And the result was a siege plan of extraordinary sophistication that came closer to breaching Dawn's masterwork than anything else the Heresy produced. Dawn countered. Every move of Perturabo's Dawn read and responded to with the defensive genius that the Emperor's commission had been based on, and that the commission had been correct to rely on. The two brothers conducted their final conversation through the medium of artillery trajectories and trench geometries, and the specific micro-decisions of force allocation that a siege at this scale produces every hour. Each one pushed the other to the limit of what their respective capabilities could produce. Each one found, in the other's response, evidence that the brother he was fighting understood the craft at a depth that only one other person in the galaxy shared. Whether this produced satisfaction or grief or both in Perturabo is not something the accounts of the siege address directly. The accounts address the tactical dimension. The emotional dimension is left to inference, and the inference that the Iron Warrior's subsequent behavior suggests is that the Siege of Terra was, for Perturabo, the experience that confirmed everything and resolved nothing. He had demonstrated his capability. He had fought the fight that his entire career had been preparation for. He had pushed Rogel Dawn, the man the Emperor had chosen over him, to the breaking point of the palace's defenses. And then Horus had died, and the demonstration had been rendered strategically irrelevant, and the fight had been ended by factors that had nothing to do with the engineering excellence that both brothers had brought to it. The withdrawal from Terra was the last time the Iron Warriors functioned as a full legion in the organizational sense that the Crusade would have recognized. The grand companies that emerged from the post-heresy fragmentation were the legion's adaptation to the conditions of the Eye and the Long War. Each one a self-contained military formation capable of independent operation, each one led by a warsmith whose authority derived from demonstrated capability rather than from the institutional hierarchy that the Crusade's administrative structure had provided. The warsmith culture that developed within the Iron Warriors' post-heresy organizational structure is worth examining, because it tells you something about what the Iron Warriors value and how those values have been maintained across millennia of the specific pressures that the Eye of Terra's environment produces. A warsmith is not simply a commander. He is a craftsman. His craft is siege warfare, and the mastery of that craft is the criterion by which his authority is assessed by the warriors who serve under him and by the other warsmiths, who compete with him for resources and territory and the specific form of professional standing that the Iron Warriors culture distributes to its most capable practitioners. The competition is relentless. It is also, in its own cold way, one of the more effective quality control mechanisms that any military organization in the galaxy has developed. A warsmith who cannot defend his position against the ambitions of the warsmiths around him is a warsmith whose capability has been weighed by the most demanding possible judges and found insufficient. The Iron Warriors do not maintain commanders who are insufficient. They replace them through the specific mechanism of the challenge and the duel and the campaign of subversion and the engineering of opportunity that the most capable aspirants use to remove the less capable occupants of positions they consider themselves better suited to. The result, accumulated across 10,000 years of continuous operation under this selection pressure, is a command cadre whose average capability is extraordinarily high by any measure available, and whose relationship to each other is defined entirely by the professional assessment of who is best at the thing they all do. There is no warmth in this relationship. There is no brotherhood in the sense that the word carries in the loyal Space Marine chapters. No bond of shared identity and mutual commitment that transcends the practical requirements of the current operational situation. There is competence. There is the recognition of competence. And there is the specific and constant awareness that the recognition can be withdrawn at any moment if the competence that justifies it is not maintained. The Iron Warrior's long war is not fought in the name of chaos. It is not fought in the name of vengeance or redemption or any of the larger purposes that other traitor legions attach to their continued campaign against the Imperium. It is fought because the Iron Warriors are siege engineers, and the galaxy contains fortifications, and the siege of those fortifications is the activity that the Iron Warriors' entire culture is organized around. The Long War is not a crusade. It is a career. The distinction is everything. The career continues. The fortifications of the Imperium continue to present themselves as problems requiring the application of the Iron Warrior's craft, and the Iron Warriors continue to apply that craft with the excellence that 10,000 years of practice has refined to a degree that no other force in the galaxy can match, and that the Imperium's defenders can resist but cannot exceed. The warsmiths plan their campaigns with the specific patient thoroughness that the craft demands. The legionnaires execute the plans with the professional commitment that the culture requires. The sieges proceed at the measured pace that the engineering assessment prescribes. And the iron endures through the eye's corruption and the warp's influence and the 10,000 years of fighting that has not produced the victory that victory's definition would require. The iron endures, not because endurance is a virtue that the Iron Warriors celebrate, because endurance is the nature of iron, and the Iron Warriors are what their name says they are. And the name has never been wrong, and the nature that the name describes does not require celebration to persist. The boy from Olympia could see the flaw in everything. The flaw in the Imperium was that it could not see him. The flaw produced the Iron Warriors. The Iron Warriors are still here, and somewhere in the darkness of the segmentum obscurus, on a world whose name the garrison commander has not yet learned to fear, the forward observation teams have reported something. Anomalous readings at the edge of the system's sensor envelope. Movement that does not correspond to any scheduled traffic. A pattern that the experienced officers recognize before the pattern recognition algorithms confirm it. Because the experienced officers have served long enough to know what the pattern means, and because the pattern has been consistent for 10,000 years. The Iron Warriors are approaching. They have done their assessment. They have identified the weaknesses in the defensive architecture. They have calculated the sequence of pressures that will degrade the fortifications in the order that produces maximum effect for minimum expenditure. They have planned the campaign with the thoroughness that distinguishes their approach from every other force in the galaxy. They are ready. They have been ready since the first day their warsmith turned his attention to this system and began the analysis that the system's defenses were built to prevent and that the defenses cannot prevent, because the minds analyzing them have been studying defenses like them for longer than the defenses have existed. The garrison commander receives the report. He reads it in the command center of his fortress. He looks at the walls that his engineers have maintained, and that the standard doctrine he was trained in has prepared him to defend with the methods and the tactics and the forced dispositions that the doctrine prescribes. He knows, if he is honest with himself in the specific way that honesty requires when the threat assessment is what this assessment is, that the doctrine was not written to address a force whose understanding of his fortifications exceeds his own understanding of them, and that the methods and tactics and force dispositions he has available are the methods and tactics and force dispositions that the Iron Warriors have been defeating for 100 centuries. He will fight anyway. He is Imperial. The walls will be held as long as they can be held, and the men behind them will do what the men behind them have always done when the Iron Warriors come, which is to resist with everything available, and to call for reinforcement, and to buy the time that the reinforcement requires to arrive, and to hope that the time is enough. The time is sometimes enough. The Iron Warriors have been stopped before, and they will be stopped again. Not through the discovery of a decisive counter to their methodology, but through the accumulation of small advantages that the defender's preparation and the attacker's operational constraints sometimes combine to produce. The fortress holds. The reinforcement arrives. The Iron Warriors withdraw because the assessment's updated calculation indicates that the cost of continuation exceeds the value of the objective. They withdraw and they move to the next objective, and the next assessment begins. But the time is sometimes not enough. The Iron Warriors' assessment is accurate. The siege proceeds on schedule. The walls degrade at the rate the engineering predicted. The garrison's capability diminishes at the pace the attrition model specified. The reinforcement does not arrive before the specific window that the Iron Warriors' calculation identified as the window in which the fortress's fall becomes inevitable. The fortress falls. The wall that was built to hold does not hold. The people behind it discover what it means to have been defended by a structure whose weaknesses were understood by the force assaulting it before the assault began. Both outcomes happen. Both outcomes will continue to happen. The Iron Warriors will continue to assess and to siege and to reduce the fortifications of the Imperium with the measured, professional, emotionally absent precision that 10,000 years have refined into the purest possible expression of what Perturabo's gene seed produces. The Imperium will continue to build fortifications and garrison them and defend them with the courage and the determination and the faith that the Imperium's own culture produces in the soldiers who serve it. The two things will continue to meet across the galaxy in the specific geometry of siege warfare that both sides understand from opposite ends of the same principles. The iron endures. The walls are built. The siege begins. Sleep now. Iron within, iron without.